All right, I am Michelle Cobb from AudioFile magazine, and you may know me from other things, but it is the same, in fact, Michelle Cobb. I'm very pleased today that we could partner with the fantastic Alan Ruben for a little guide to some home recording now that we are all fully stuck at home. A little about AudioFile magazine if you don't know us too well. And if only, there we go. We really welcome you. It is AudioFile AudioFile magazine. That's the way you may see our name on social. We are the only magazine that is 100% devoted to audiobook reviews. We review about 2,500 audiobooks each year, and we really encourage you to follow us on social, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I feel like I'm forgetting something big, YouTube, all of those channels, and subscribe to the Behind the Mic podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts and all of your other podcast things. I get to guest on the podcast once a month and talk about 5 different books, which I've listened to, which is always fun. Now, we are always supporting narrators, and we hope that you will support us too. We have a guide, a talent guide, that is available for producers and publishers across the globe to find audiobook narrators. When you become a talent guide listing professional with us, this includes the real-time reviews newsletter that goes out every Thursday with new reviews for you to take a look at. And here is a link to the reference guide, which we will put in the chat box. So we are offering a special discount. If you didn't get your APAC, didn't get the listing through APAC, you can get it through this special partner discount that we're offering right now. And we want to know what you are up to. So if you have a review or have a title that you're particularly proud of that you would like to be reviewed, keep the editorial team at AudioFile apprised of your work. This doesn't mean send us every title that you're doing, but the ones that you feel are best, send a little note to editorial@audiofilemagazine.com. Oops, I forgot the .com, but of course .com. And tell us why this book is particularly special for you. You don't need to send us any kind of code if it will be available on Audible. You just need to send us to a link when it's available, or you can work with the publisher to actually send us a pre-release copy. It doesn't have to be pre-released, whatever works best for you. All right, that's my little AudioFile pitch, and now I'm going to move us on to talking to the fantastic Grammy-winning producer and director, Alan Ruben. Today, he's going to be talking about all sorts of things for us, and I have some questions that were emailed in, plus I'll be taking your questions. Don't put them in the chat box. We won't see them there. Be sure to put them in Q&A. I am going to step out for a few minutes and leave Paul to do his thing, and I'll be back when we're ready to take questions. Take it away, Paul.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you to this audiobook webinar, Upping Your Performance Game While Recording at Home, now that you're really at home and only at home. First of all, I really do want to thank Michelle Cobb from AudioFile magazine, and also AudioFile's publisher, Robin Whitten, for sponsoring this mini webinar, if I can call it that. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for listening in. I'm going to assume that most of the listeners are narrators, but I'm hoping that maybe there's a few consumers listening also. If you are a consumer, I'm going to apologize in advance for maybe a little bit of actor speak. But that said, the webinar's goal is pretty simple. It's really to discuss performance. So first, I'd like to give you an idea of what I think makes you, the consumer, or even another narrator, say, wow, that Mary Smith, she is some narrator. Or Mary Smith, ugh, get the hook. Second, I'd like to dive in a little bit to what my experience suggests, and that is narrator's greatest performance opportunity and singular performance challenge. And third, I'd like to offer some specific tools, techniques, I guess you can call them, that can make up your performance game, or that rather can help you up your performance game and make you a more compelling storyteller. So very briefly, I want to kind of break down this hour or so to no more than 30 minutes of me speaking, and then the next half hour to answer your questions, which hopefully you'll have some based on what I'm saying, or if you've sent them in advance, happy to try to answer those too. But again, again, in the short amount of time that I have, I do want to just focus this sort of mini webinar on fiction, dramatic fiction, maybe a little bit nonfiction, but there's just not enough time for me to focus on everything, because fiction and nonfiction do have some different challenges, and I just don't think I can get it all in half an hour. So we'll focus on fiction. Very briefly, I am a Grammy-winning audiobook producer. I've actually won 2 Grammys for Best Spoken Word. I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I've also been a coach, storytelling teacher, also for a substantial period of time. And I would say that in the last couple of decades, I've had come across some really wonderful people. I've had the opportunity to cast some people who did their first audiobook, or work with some people in my workshops who then had never done an audiobook and then went on to, become regular audiobook narrators, some even, dare I say, household words. And some of the people that I gave my start to, or let me say, participated in getting their start, I don't want to be too presumptuous, but some of those people are Holzer Graham, Eduardo Ballerini, Michael Crouch, Oliver Wyman, Chris Delane, Maggie Mae Reed, Cassandra Morris, Caitlin Davies, and other people too. So I hope that what all this suggests to you is that what working with all these talented people really means to me is why I still enjoy this work, why I love it, why I love working with actors, why I love coaching, and why I always get so much out of various narrators' performances. So let's get started. So what exactly do I mean by up your game? That expression is used quite often. And in terms of audiobook narration, what does up your game actually mean? What it means to me is becoming a more compelling storyteller. So now on to a little bit how narrators actually up their performance game. And I'd like to address this question by taking a look at the narrator's greatest opportunity along with the narrator's most significant challenge. So kind of weaving those two things in, I hope will ultimately give you an idea of what I think it means to ultimately up your game. So that's where the subtitle comes in, connection versus presentation. So what makes for compelling storytelling? In my opinion, the answer is the narrator's greatest opportunity. That is connection, meaning emotionally connecting the story's feelings to the listener. What most compromises compelling storytelling? What's the greatest challenge? My word would be presentation, meaning emotionally disconnecting the story's feelings from the listener. So before unpacking what makes compelling narration, first, let me kind of define for you what I think an audiobook narrator is. So Michelle, slide 1, please. Here's my definition of an audiobook narrator. Noun, open heart surgeon. The audiobook narrator's dual function is performing open heart surgery. By opening their heart and connecting to the story's feelings, aka subtext, and then connecting that emotionality to the listener. Subtext is the emotionality embedded in the words, just in case you're not an actor, and that word is not something that you are used to. So again, the subtext is merely the feelings underneath the words in the story. So with that definition in mind, it's important to remember that what follows is predicated on this very important performance proposition. audiobook narration is 100% acting, 0% voicing. And with that, I hope that the following will convince you that acting, the pathway to emotional connection, is far more engaging to listeners than presentation, the pathway to emotional disconnection. Ultimately, my experience in the last couple of decades as a director, as a coach, as a producer, is simply that listeners would much prefer being connected to the story's emotionality by the narrator than disconnected from the text's feelings. It really is that simple. So let me begin and talk a little bit about connection versus presentation. Michelle, I think we're ready for the next slide. Let's look at connection. The compelling storyteller's job one. No connection, no story, just words on a page. Blah, blah, blah. Connection's definition: an emotional pathway between the narrator's intuitive capacity to experience feelings and the story's emotionality or the subtext. So why is connection so vital? Three main reasons. One, because connection is the foundation of the narrator's job one, which is connecting their emotional resources, the heart, to the text's feelings, and in turn, connecting those feelings to the listener. That's it. That's job 1 through 100. Number two, because connection is the narrator's only pathway to the subtext. Remember this. Number three, because if the narrator cannot commit their emotional resources to connect to the story's subtext, they cannot engage the listener, no matter how nice, no matter how wonderful, no matter how velvety their voice is. So let me try to just summarize what I've suggested. One, the narrator is not responsible for the author's words. That's the author's responsibility. In other words, the narrator is not responsible for the actual syntax or even the meaning. That's the author's job. What the narrator is responsible for is connecting the feelings, the subtext, embedded in the author's words to the listener. Narrator's emotional commitment to organically, by that I mean honestly, connecting to the subtext is their pathway to believably replicating those feelings, to creating a compelling performance. And let me just say that again, the narrator's overall job, among other things, is to create not only a compelling performance, but to essentially create reality, something that the narrator believes is real, that the listener believes is realistic. So let's talk a little bit about presentation. Hey, a lot of people say you have a great voice. You should be an audiobook narrator. Yes? No, not if you think the voice can act. So what is presentation? Why am I obsessing about this? And why is it the narrator's singular challenge? Well, let's first define presentation. In a word, presentation is reporting. It is prioritizing the voice to report events and indicate feelings. Now, let me repeat that. Presenting prioritizes the voice over the heart or feelings. Presenting employs the voice to act. Presenting reports what's happening in the story. Presenting reports what the characters feel. So definition in hand, what exactly is presentation's problem? What's wrong with it? The answer is very simple, but I think very profound in terms of storytelling. And the simple answer is the voice can't act, cannot. So what can the voice do? Well, the voice can make sound. The voice can indicate the story's feelings by way of inauthentic, meaning not actually felt by the narrator, emphasis. It can add music, it can kind of be sing-songy, it can modulate, so on and so forth. Do all those things. In other words, the voice can pretend to act. So the bottom line for me is that the voice is the great pretender. A question always arises, I think about it all the time, what is it or why is it that narrators believe so much in the voice, or at least sort of act as if the voice gives them the opportunity to be a compelling storyteller? I honestly don't know the answer. I could think about it, we could talk about it perhaps, but I think at the end of the day, many actors or narrators believe that if they vocally help the words, that somehow that will create compelling performance. I would like to suggest that it is the exact opposite. And the reason is, go back and think about what I suggested earlier, the voice can't act. So to reiterate, what can the heart do? The heart can feel, the heart can connect to the story's feelings, honestly, organically connect those feelings to the listener. That's what the heart can do. That's what the actor can do. If upping your game means connecting and not presenting or voicing, how then can you begin to achieve this more compelling performance? Here's the first thing that you can do and must do. Connect to the subtext 100% of the time. And here it's important to say that 100% of the words in your author's fiction have subtext, all of them. Even when the author is describing something where it appears that there's nothing going on, there always is. There's always subtext. Because if there isn't subtext, there's nothing for you to connect to. And if you don't connect to those feelings, you are going to sound like blah, blah, blah. What else can you do? You can make the subtext your co-director, maybe even your director, because only the subtext, that is the emotionality, can propel organic, honest, dramatic choices, and in a way no director can possibly direct. So in other words, the subtext is what dictates the emphasis, not the voice. Let me say that differently. When the subtext dictates the emphasis, that's how you have a chance for organic, believable storytelling. When the voice dictates the emphasis, when the voice emphasizes, you have no possibility for anything other than basically reporting. And that is not emotionally connecting. Upping your game means honoring the medium. Storytelling is an intimate medium. It's just you in a booth with a microphone. So you need to train yourself to act intimately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. You also need to intuit the character's feelings and commit your heart to them. So that especially when you are doing, for example, even in third person, when you're even talking about a character, you want to continue to intuit that character's feelings and commit yourself to those feelings. You want to intuit the emotional stakes and commit your heart to those emotional stakes, meaning whatever the conflict is, whatever it is that's causing, Sturm und Drang with various characters. Those are the stakes. That's what you're committing yourself to. And most importantly, you want to leave your voice outside the booth. You bring your voice into the booth, you may be very tempted to use your voice to act. It can't act. It can indicate feeling, it just can't feel. You might use your voice to emphasize. It can do that. It can kind of kick a word, push a word. It can highlight a word. The problem is it can't do it believably. You have to feel it. It has to come from the heart. If the heart doesn't dictate the emphasis, don't help it. Don't emphasize anything. You don't need to. We will get it. The listener will get it. So moving on a little bit from 50,000 feet to the trenches now, how can narrators create and sustain this kind of connection? So let's take a little bit of a look, first of all, at first-person narration. This happens to me all the time when I'm working on first-person fiction. The narrator will begin to speak, and I'll say to the narrator, who are you actually talking to? So if you notice, most first-person fiction doesn't begin with actual quotation marks. It's not dialogue. I mean, there might be some dialogue at the beginning, but most of it, or a lot of it at least, is not dialogue. You just hear Paul or Mary or Michelle talking. Well, who's Michelle talking to? So what I think the narrator needs to do immediately is place that narrator, or place that first person, so that you can connect to that person, and so that you can, in effect, have a sense of where you are, who you're talking to, as opposed to just speaking out there from the universe. And I like to tell narrators two of the following. You can pick whatever you choose, or if there's something else you like, pick that. One, you can be talking to your best friend or to somebody that you know very well at a bar or across a table. Again, think intimate. This is an intimate kind of performance. So you're only a couple of feet away from that person. Two, you might be talking to your shrink, to your therapist. When you talk to your shrink, when you talk to your therapist, your job is presumably to give of yourself emotionally, and you can let it all hang out depending on what's going on in the story. And that then gives you something to focus on. So my advice when you do first person, have a sense, commit yourself to who it actually is you're talking to. Let's look at third person. Third person presents a whole nother challenge. The third person's job one, what is it? The third person's job one is to tell the story from the point of view of who or what you're talking about. It is that point of view that you must connect yourself to. That's exactly how you establish this sense of connection to the subtext. So the point of view is the person you're talking about. It could even be the thing you're talking about, because there's always going to be subtext. There's always going to be an emotionality under that the author is going to help you understand. And a metaphor that I like for point of view that helps you, again, up your game, gives you a little bit more to kind of work on in terms of upping your performance game is something, kind of a metaphor that I like to refer to as Tinkerbell. So if you imagine point of view, if you imagine that the narrator is talking about Paul, I'm Paul, and imagine that Tinkerbell is over my head. So there's the point of view. And the sentence is something like, Paul walked in the room and realized that he just didn't want to be an audiobook director anymore. So I could narrate the line, Paul walked in the room and realized he just didn't want to be a narrator anymore. Or sorry, he just didn't want to be an audiobook director anymore. All right, let me try that one more time. Paul walked in the room and realized he just didn't want to be an audiobook director anymore. That's presented. Sounds, I guess, okay, but to me, I wouldn't want to hear it that way. So you can excuse my less than award-winning acting, but you could also walk in and now again, think of Tinkerbell, think of the point of view. So here's Tinkerbell right over my head. Paul walked in the room and sat down and realized, and now Tinkerbell's going to get a little further inside my head, and realized he just didn't want to be an audiobook director anymore. Okay, let me try that one more time. So imagine Tinkerbell here and then Tinkerbell here. Paul walked in the room and sat down and realized he just didn't want to be an audiobook director anymore. So what do you hear? Or what do you what are you hearing? You're hearing me, the narrator, connecting to Paul, who's the point of view. And not only that, I'm getting a little bit inside Paul's head as I narrate that sentence. And that is something else that I often tell narrators. Get in the head of the point of view. That's your job. Get in their head. When the text presents that opportunity, which it always does in fiction, get in their head. How do you know when exactly to get in their head? You're going to intuit that. If you're an actor, you will intuit it. And maybe in a question and answer, we can talk a little bit more about it. Finally, and importantly, you as a third person narrator are the equivalent of a sponge or a kind of a vessel. You are not a commentator. You do not comment on the action. Another direction I give very often, if you've worked with me or had me in a coaching, in a workshop or individually, how many times have I suggested less, 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 less? And what I'm suggesting is less voice. So let me explain that. In dramatic fiction, you're in a very intimate medium. You do not need to speak with a lot of voice. In fact, when you speak with too much voice, what that does is it inhibits your capacity to connect to the subtext, and it actually inhibits your capacity to make dramatic choices. It's simply overkill. When you use less voice, less, so long as you are connecting to the feelings, so long as you're in touch with the feelings, you have more opportunity to connect to the subtext. So let me just give you an example real quick. Again, you can excuse my less than award-winning acting. I could say to you, or I could say for the following, I could talk to Michelle and say, Michelle, how about you and I go out and talk about audiobook narration? Okay. I could say, Michelle, how about you and I go out and talk about this audiobook connection? So you're hearing, obviously, a much less voice. So the question is, which of those two, number one or number two, might you think maybe Michelle needs, a weapon to defend herself? All right. So what I'm arguing is the following: is that less voice, so long as you are emotionally connected to the subtext, actually provides you more opportunity to connect and more opportunity to make the kinds of dramatic choices that a director could never direct. Very quickly, discover. This is what keeps you in the moment. How do you discover? You discover by use of punctuation. Let me go back and explain discovery. If 1,000 people were listening to me right now and you asked all 1,000 people, is he actually reading this word for word, or is he more or less speaking extemporaneously, maybe referring to his notes? I think all 1,000 people would say, he sounds like he's speaking more or less extemporaneously. Well, why is that? How do you know that? The way you know that is that I am actually discovering what it is that I want to say. It may happen in a millisecond, but I am discovering it. So while you're narrating, if you look at the punctuation, you will see that the comma, the period, all the other punctuation, the semicolon, etc., all of those are beat changes. All of those give you opportunities to discover. So again, you could take a sentence. Michelle walked in the room and realized she didn't want to work for AudioFile anymore. All right, so here's the sentence. Michelle walked in the room, comma, and realized she didn't want to work for AudioFile anymore. So now we're going to honor the comma. First, we won't honor the comma. Michelle walked in the room and realized she didn't want to work for AudioFile anymore. Or Michelle walked in the room and realized she didn't want to work for AudioFile anymore. So you hear that pause there. You hear me honoring that little white space there between the comma and the next word so that I can effectively discover what it is that Michelle is thinking. And that's how you stay in the moment. That's how you discover. That's how you use the punctuation to help you connect to the point of view and sound as if this is all happening right now, which is what engages the listener. Very quickly, dialogue. Your job with dialogue is to speak like a real person. How do you speak like a real person? The first thing you do is react. I've heard a lot of dialogue and a lot of audiobooks where I hear line. I don't hear this character reacting to the character who just spoke before them, and then that character reacting. And this is kind of a basic acting 101 proposition. Acting is reacting. Lastly, and I cannot emphasize this too much, take your characters seriously. If you're an actor, you're going to know what that means. Take your characters seriously. Very often narrators have a tendency to effectively report the dialogue. You can't do that. Take them seriously. They're coming from somewhere. They're feeling something. Take them seriously. Stay committed to the emotional stakes. On a scale of 1 to 10, the emotional stakes are always a 10. What do I mean by that? That doesn't mean, 10 doesn't mean go crazy. That means you are committed to those emotional stakes at a 10. It's your commitment that needs to be at a 10. Don't report it, feel it. That should be your mantra. Lastly, I want to suggest to you a couple of final thoughts. And that would be the following. Connect, stay committed, don't present, don't help the words because you can't, play the stakes, less, take your character seriously, take the story seriously, take yourself seriously as a storyteller. Final thought. Listen back to something you've recorded if you even think, maybe it doesn't quite sound like it should. And ask yourself, am I connected? Am I committed? Am I in the moment? Am I taking my characters seriously? Am I discovering? Am I connecting to the point of view? Am I in the character's head? These are the kinds of questions you can ask yourself. These are some of the things that we've just talked about. Who am I talking to if it's first person? Ask yourself these questions. You're going to be able to answer them, and I pretty much can guarantee you that if you're an actor, you're going to be able to say yes or no, and on that basis, you can either go back and redo it, or you can say, gee, that was fabulous, and you can continue. That's pretty much it. So actually, is that it? Yes, I think that is. I'm done. I'm completely done. So I would like to turn this over to question and answer right now. And hopefully some of the things I've said have made some sense to you. And if not, and you have a question, let me try to work hard to make them make sense or answer something that I haven't talked about.
Great. Well, thank you. And here's the slide that goes along with all this. He never said change slide, and so I just didn't do it.
So sorry.
That's all right.
Bad.
It's on me.
Yeah.
But I couldn't see the next slide either. So
Sorry about that.
that's okay. All right. So we've got some questions. Let's start with Stephen J. Cohen asking, is subtext subjective? See, this is why I'm not a narrator. Let's try this again. Is subtext subjective? If both you and I read a story, can we validly come away with two different takes on the subtext?
All right, it's a great question. I'm going to answer the question and say no with an asterisk. It's very possible that you may not absolutely positively understand exactly what the emotionality is based on what the author is giving you. That said, authors are pretty good, from the best story to the worst story, of helping you understand what the feeling is, what the character is feeling. And it's your job as a storyteller, as an actor, to do your best to intuit that feeling and then replicate it. And in answer to Stephen's question, yeah, you might be wrong, but in my experience, actors mostly are correct. And again, this is an art, not a science. So it's a great question. And again, the answer is for you to do your best to intuit those feelings and then commit yourself to them.
All right. Steve Marvel wants to know, can you list any discrete, specific steps you should suggest narrators use to prepare a text to narrate?
Boy, I definitely can. Number one, if it's fiction, let's say, don't underline anything. Why is that? Because that means you're going to be aware of it, and that means more than likely you are going to use your voice to emphasize whatever it is you've underlined. I'll go back to telling you, trust yourself. If you're an actor and if you're connected, you want to be able to allow that subtext to direct you. So that's number one. Number two, you should know on every page, in every sentence, by every word, what is the feeling. So if you were prepping your book and I said, can you turn to page 50? And I pointed to the first paragraph on that page and I said, what's the feeling? You ought to be able to tell me. And I would add very quickly, in addition, I've often worked with narrators where they began to narrate right out of the get-go. And I've stopped them after, a solid 5 or 10 seconds and say to them, oh, okay, let me just stop you for a second. What's the feeling? What is the character feeling that you're narrating here? And what do you think I hear? Well, the character just came back from the hardware store. Well, I say that's fine, but that's not a feeling, therefore that's not actable. And so it's very important to remember that the only thing you can act is a feeling. So you need to know the feelings, you need to know what's going on emotionally, otherwise you can't commit yourself to those things and you can't tell the story. So that's how you prep, that's how you prepare. Yes, you got to know your characters. Yes, you got to know accents. Yes, you got to know how to look up words and so on and so forth. All those things are important. But those, strictly speaking, don't have anything to do with performance, though they're important.
Well, this is kind of an interesting question / statement. So Pete Farron says, every author publisher says, I like your voice, or in some disguised fashion, I don't like it. After well over 100 books, no one refers to emotions, acting ability, communicating ability, or compellingness. What would you say to that?
I say that's a very good question. And I would say, do your best not to say what I'm going to say to you. And that's the following. It's very easy to identify something like a voice and believe, even if you're a consumer, that somehow a nice voice is the key to telling a story. I would argue the following. If you took the person who said that, and I took two different narrators, one with a nice voice, but one with just a regular normal voice that didn't jump out at you, and yet was a great storyteller, 100% of the time, that person would prefer the great storyteller, the person that's emotionally connected. So you have to do your best to say politely that, in your opinion, connecting to the book's emotionality is what propels listeners to become engaged. And let me add the following. Some of the best narrators that I've worked with, and I named a few, I really don't want to name a lot of names, but I named them in the beginning, so let's just take them. Eduardo Ballerini, Oliver Wyman, Caitlin Davies. If you heard these people talk in a crowd, I promise you, you would not say, oh my God, what a great voice. What makes them such wonderful storytellers? Why are they so popular? What is it about them? What is it about Holter Grimm that makes him such a great storyteller? Not his voice.
Interesting. Well, a couple of people have asked this, so this is obviously something people really want to know about now that they've seen your slide. Can you tell us more about more, this principle in comedy? Explain that. What does that mean?
Okay. Humor tends to be exaggerated, and that's what I mean by more. You can tell in the syntax, you can tell by kind of looking at the story that it's humor, right? Generally speaking, in humor, the way we know that it's humor, two things are going on. Number one, there's a lot of kind of exaggeration. It almost seems as if the characters are overly everything. Now, the challenge with that is you still have to take it seriously, right? It's just that there's a lot of exaggeration. The second thing about humor and what makes it so challenging, I think, for narrators is what I just suggested, which is that you as the storyteller have to take it seriously, even though it's exaggerated. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, and this is, I think, what really helps me at least understand why I say more. In humor, as opposed to drama, there is no empathy. Empathy only exists in drama. It does not exist in humor, because if it did, you wouldn't laugh. And if you think about it, an enormous amount of humor is actually based on terrible things happening to people. Oh my God, I walked in the house, the place was a mess, which actually is bad, right? So if you were to narrate that and say, oh my God, I walked in the house with a lot less voice, what you're telling the listener is that this is, I want you to empathize with this. I want you to emotionally connect to this. In humor, it's not about emotional connection. It's not about empathy. It's about reference level. It's about you understanding intuitively what it is, or intellectually, I should say, what it is that's funny about something. And if you do, you'll laugh. If you don't, you won't laugh. You don't understand it. So again, humor, intellect, drama, emotion, therefore more exaggeration in humor, less in drama. I'm giving you a very truncated version, but that essentially is the difference.
Leanne Woodward actually sent in a question earlier this week. She asks, how do I maintain emotional investment and believability for hour after hour in the booth? I think I'm emoting well, but when I listen back, it's flatter than I thought.
Oh, I love that question. Here's my answer. Take your characters seriously. Take your story seriously. What's happening is, as soon as you stop taking your characters and stop taking your story seriously, you drift off into vocalizing. So what that means is you're taking the emotionality seriously. In drama, in fiction, for example, in all fiction, all of it, 100% of the books that you narrate, of the fictional books you narrate, guess what they involve? Conflict. Is conflict fun? And oh. So right away, in all fiction, every fiction you read, good, bad, indifferent, you're going to see dissonance, conflict, people wanting something, can't get it, a lot of Sturm und Drang, Spilkus, whatever, and that's what you're connected to. That's what you need to take seriously. And as soon as you stop taking that seriously, you often are tempted to revert to blah, 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 presenting blah, 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 blah. So what you can do is you can stop and you can say to myself, I don't recall the person's name who asked this question. Do you, Michelle?
Leanne, yes.
You can say to yourself, self, or Leanne, am I taking this character seriously? Am I taking this story seriously? Am I connected emotionally? Am I? Or am I just saying the words?
So this is a good follow-on question, I think, from Amanda Berry. What would your advice on dealing with very dramatic scenes be? I don't want to be yelling into people's ears, but I want to be true to the emotionality.
You have to be true to the emotionality. So let me go back to yelling. If the line is, I hate you, she yelled at the top of her lungs. Look, this is a very emotional, a very intimate medium. You can't scream your brains out or you'll blow up your computer. But you can say, I hate you, she said, screaming. The listener will buy that. The listener will understand that as screaming. You can look down literally from your microphone so you won't pop. And you can say, I hate you. Okay, you can do that. She screamed. You'll be believed. So I would also like to say the following, and this I think is something narrators can always understand and can always think about. Unless it says screamed at the top of her lungs, less, less, less. Here's what I tell narrators: feel it, don't help the words. Feel it, don't help it. So you're allowed to say, Michelle, I just don't think you and I should ever see each other again. You don't have to say, Michelle, I don't think you and I should ever see each other again. Now, I know none of you are going to be that bad, but you hear the difference. Don't be afraid of less, less, less. And here's the big if, put an asterisk next to it. If you're connected to the stakes, if you're connected to the feeling. What less, less, less does is it allows the listener inside the story. It allows the listener to be present. And if you help it, you effectively push the listener away. You tell the listener, I don't need you. I'm going to help the words. I'm going to be loud. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to report it. You just sit back and relax. That's not what the listener wants. They want to be engaged. Less, less, less really works to engage that listener.
So Ed Phillips wants to know, how do you prepare before you tell a story? Is there anything else you can do to get your body and mind ready?
Well, that's a good question. And a lot of narrators have very specific ways that they like to prepare, everything from little vocal exercises and other things that they do. And I think they're all great and fine and they work. In my opinion, the preparation should be the following. Here's how you prepare. You look at the very first line and you ask yourself, let's say that it's first person. Okay, that means Michelle is now speaking. The first thing you ask yourself is, what's Michelle feeling? That's question number one. Question number two, at what level is she feeling it? What are the stakes? Once those things are recognized by you, then you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to connect to those feelings. All right? I'm going to connect my heart to those feelings. I'm not going to help the words, but I'm going to connect. That's how I would suggest you begin right before you say the very first line. I cannot tell you how many times I've said to a narrator, what is Michelle feeling? Well, I am, and once that occurs, it means there's no story. Nothing's happening. You're disconnected. You don't want to be that. You want to be the opposite.
I've got an anonymous question. This person is trained as a classical singer and often finds that when they try to narrate, they have vocal problems, huskiness, dryness, which they don't have when they're singing. They can't figure out how to improve this, though. They've had, training in breath, body, voice, energy, dance, and they're doing their best to follow the ideas that you've outlined, and that they've been told to completely become the characters, be compelling. But how can they truly invest themselves without hurting their voice and body?
That's a great question. First of all, I'm going to answer this question anonymously because after all, I got the question came anonymous. This is an anonymous answer, not me. Ironically, what I call vocal push, which a lot of narrators do, helping the words, too much emphasis, strains the voice. Take your characters and the story seriously. Stay committed to the emotional stakes, scale of 1 to 10. If I do that, I'm not going to be able to speak after 5 minutes. So don't push. Don't vocally push. It's very counterintuitive because when you're narrating something that's very dramatic, there's this tendency to want to help the words, to want to push emotionally. And the irony is that if you do that, the more you push, the less you connect the listener, the more you actually push them away from you. So again, if you want to preserve your voice, don't push, don't push. Feel it, but don't help the words. Other than that, I go for drinking a lot of water and all those things, and I think you'll be okay. But it's that push, it's that you're forcing that emotion. And that's what often makes narrators, with a very short time, start to feel challenged vocally.
Brent Halfyard wants to know how many chapters or pages in a day is a good amount to narrate.
I can tell you my experience is working for some of the bigger publishers, and they usually like us. I'm doing a book right now with a wonderful narrator, and our job is to basically do 3 finished hours in, let's say, 7 or 8 hours of recording. So you want to be able to create 1 finished hour in about 2 hours of recording. So I would not look at these things in terms of pages. I would look at them in terms of word count. The average finished hour is about 9,400 words. So in 2 hours of recording, you want to be able to have about 18,000 plus words done. So you look at your story. If your story is 100,000 words, you divide by 9,400. You can see how many finished hours it is, and then you do the math, and you can tell about how long it's going to take you if you do it 2 to 1.
That's some good math exercise there, too.
Thank you. Well. That's the extent of my math, too.
Cassandra Morris wants to know, when performing adult fiction, how far should narrators go with putting on voices for characters? Do subtle shifts in tone work, or should it be more about shifts in delivery?
I'm sorry, more about what?
Shifts in delivery.
Subtlety is always the operative word. I like shifts in delivery. At the risk of asking you, Michelle, to repeat this, I want to be clear about what the question is. I'm not quite sure. Do you mind just repeating it so that I don't just answer a question I think
sure.
Not the one I am being asked?
When performing adult fiction, how far should narrators go with putting on voices?
Okay, I got it. All right.
Is it do subtle shifts in tone work, or should it be more about shifts in delivery?
Okay, so first of all, you got to pay attention to what the author tells you. If the author tells you she has a low gravelly voice and a Southern accent, then that's what you got to do. If it's really thick, then that's what you got to do. If you don't see something specific like that, always subtle, always a subtle shift in the voice. The listener will buy into it as long as the shift is as long as you can sort of hear it. Always subtle. And why am I saying subtle? For the following reason. all listeners are in what's called a state of willing suspension of disbelief. If you're an actor, I know you know what that means. So anything you do to disturb that willing state of suspension of disbelief is going to take them out of the story. So they understand that it's only one person in a booth playing a million different people. They know that you're not all these characters. So all you have to do is give a kind of a subtle shift, either in delivery or even maybe a little bit vocally. But often I find delivery will help. One character might speak just a little more rapidly than the other. One might pause a little bit more, be a little more deliberate in the way that they speak. And I find that if you're, let's say, a woman doing a book and it's adult fiction, and you've got 5 women all talking to each other, or a few women, you may not just be able to change your voice so it sounds like 5 different women talking. It's not necessary. You can change your cadence. You can change your pitch just subtly. And that helps us understand, oh, that's this person, that's this person. But subtlety is the key.
Robert Brinkman asks, when you think of your favorite narrators, what is it about them that stands out to you? And I will say for me, a lot of it is those shifts in delivery that you were just talking about.
Yeah, me too. That sounds almost like a trick question, like, you know, because I'm going to say. So here's what stands out to me. What stands out to me is the character's relentless connection to the subtext. And when that occurs, as Michelle said, you're going to get all kinds of variety in delivery, because what you're going to really get are multiple nuanced dramatic choices that you simply cannot get unless you're connected to the subtext. I think that's what you're saying, Michelle.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Joshua Kane says, regarding accents, is it necessary to be able to perform a totally authentic accent for each character, or are just traces enough?
Again, it depends on the book, but my feeling is always less. So if you're going to do what you feel is an authentic accent, and that's what it's called for, you had better be good at it. So if you can't do a Boston accent, don't go there.
I beg you not to. I live near Boston. Don't do it.
That's right. And there's nothing worse, right, Michelle, than a narrator trying to imitate a New England accent, and they sound just totally inauthentic.
I literally was saying this exact thing to someone today.
Yes. So at the end of the day, you want to give a flavor, you want to give a hint of the accent, so that if someone is a bad person talking a little bit, maybe if they're Russian or whatever it is, maybe something like this, a little bit, so you hear a little bit of the accent, but not talk like this, right? Unless for some reason the script calls for it, and it basically never does. Because you do that, and you're liable to, again, remove that listener from that willing suspension of disbelief. That's that state of suspension of disbelief. Does that make sense?
Does to me.
Yeah.
Ruth Livier wants to, probably butchered that last name, and I apologize. What's the average time one should expect to invest when preparing a fiction book, say a 7-hour novel?
I think you should read the entire book. And the reason I do that is the obvious. You want to know what's going on in that story. And then, of course, there's the old, problem of somebody not reading the book, and they find out on page 150 that Michelle has a Southern accent. And then they're in big trouble. So you want to know the story. But the real reason you want to know the story is so that you're confident about what it is that you're narrating. You know the themes, you understand the story. It isn't so much that you need to actually know page by page what's going on to be a good narrator, but you do need to know the story. You need to know what's happening so that you can confidently narrate. Again, you may know the story backwards and forwards. So the way I would address that is the following. Why is it that the author, who knows this story 50 million times better than you do, who's not an actor, how come they can't narrate that story as good as you can, even though you don't know that story as well as they do? It's because you're an actor. It's because you know how to connect to that emotionality. And it's that emotionality, that's what it is that's propelling the listener to become engaged. But again, I don't want to undersell reading the book, underlining words that you don't know, meaning that you have to look up, marking different characters that are speaking so that the blue is Mary and the red is Paul and so on and so forth. And very importantly, understanding what emotionally is going on every single solitary page.
Gina Davies says, as a stage-trained actor, there's an audience to help gauge her performance. Other than using my instincts, is there a way you help narrators find the sweet spot of bringing the emotion to the reading without being distracting to the listener?
Well, that's really a great question too. And one of the challenges of being a narrator is that you simply do not have an audience. You don't. So it's challenging, it is. But what you do have is your ability to play back what you do and to listen to it. So my suggestion is the following. If you're connected to the subtext, if you're connected to the story, that connection is going to propel the subtext to effectively direct you. It's going to propel the subtext to determine what you emphasize, how your pace is going to go. Once that's occurring, you should be, as actors often will say, in the zone. If you're in the zone, you don't need the audience. You just don't need them. So you have to come to terms with the fact that you are engaged in an intimate medium and you don't have that sort of sense of how the audience is responding to kind of fuel you. You just don't have it. So you have to use what I just suggested as a way of connecting you and fueling yourself.
Another anonymous question. With your view on dialects, how do you feel about narrating a book in third person set in another country? So like England when you're American. Would it be acceptable to do the third person in your native voice and bring the color of the dialect to the dialogue only?
That's a good question, and it may depend on the book. If the book is in third person, and let me see if I understand this question. If the book is in third person, and if the book takes place in England, where the characters are all British, do you want to narrate the book in a British accent or narrate the book in your American dialect and only do the characters in a British accent? My gut would be that you probably want to narrate the book in a British accent because it's likely that the narrator is going to sound British. The book is going to be written kind of in a kind of British syntax and so on and so forth. That would be my reaction. Now, not always. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you're narrating a story in the third person, and the characters live in a strange country where they have a very funny accent. They sound sort of it could even be something that's a little tough on the ear, like a Eastern European accent. Depending on the story, my gut probably would be to narrate the story in your normal voice and only do the dialogue in the accent, in terms of where it takes place. It just doesn't have a one-size-fits-all answer.
Agreed. Let's see. We've got lots of questions here. I'm only going to take two more. Let's see. Lots of nonfiction questions, Paul. So I think we're going to have to ask you.
Let's talk about nonfiction. That'd be good. I mean, let's see what we get.
There's about 7 questions about any tips for nonfiction. So what tips for nonfiction?
Oh, well, is there anything even a little more specific than any tips for nonfiction? I'll talk about it. I'll give tips. So,
I mean, they're very general. I was going to say we should invite you back to do a nonfiction.
You should, and I'm happy to do it. I really feel like I could devote a half an hour or a little bit less to nonfiction, and then it would really be great to take the questions. So let me try, and you can time me in, let's say, 90 seconds to give you my sense of nonfiction.
There you go. I've got the watch up. Go.
Right. I approach nonfiction holistically. That means that I am trying to get you to do the following. 1, recognize that you are the author. You're the surrogate for whoever wrote this. Number 2, your job in nonfiction is there are no characters, there's no story, there's no plot. So what's your job? Your job is to engage the listener to the degree that that listener is listening to you with their mouth wide open and saying, wow, this is an amazing story. This is amazing. Nonfiction has nothing to do with the here and now. There's no subtext in nonfiction. Only the author's overall attitude as that author tells the story. And that attitude is going to remain the same from beginning until end. The biggest challenge in nonfiction is that narrators voice it. You cannot voice nonfiction. It's boring and it sounds like blah, 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 blah.
Well, let's see. That was, you know, it was like 75 seconds, so very good.
All right. No time left over. But
All
I have
right.
to come back and talk about nonfiction. I think nonfiction in some ways is more challenging than fiction.
Well, fantastic. We would love to have you do that. Well, I'd love to thank you very much for providing all of these excellent insights. I have put up on the screen another slide that reminds you of the talent guide listing you can get from AudioFile magazine at a discount through that link, and we'll put that back in the chat box. And we have recorded this and we'll get it up on our YouTube channel. Look for it no later than about a week from now, hopefully much, much sooner. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks to everyone for coming. And we look forward to seeing you again. Enjoy lockdown.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it very much. I hope it was useful.
I think it was.
All right.
Take care.
Yes.